Welcome to Strange Coordinates, the show where we use brands as roadmaps to arrive at surprising places. I am, as I hope you know by now, Topher Burns.
Sorry, I just stepped all over your name, Topher.
It's fine. People know it. We hope they know it.
That's right. And this is the voice of Robert Balog. This is also Robert Balog himself. Along with Idon, our partner, Topher and I are leading an ad agency called Territorial. We've spent our whole lives in advertising, helping the biggest and best loved brands find their place in the world. And the way we've done that is by exploring how history and culture and desire and all these types of things bounce off one another to reveal insights that tell us what's cool about being human.
So in every episode of Strange Coordinates, one of us gives the other a brand. That person disappears into the wilderness, comes back with the best story that they can find that is hopefully the most compelling. It's using brands as compass points to discover more about the world around us.
Yeah, and Topher, before we dive into this week's episode, for the listener out there who has not checked into our last episode on Chiquita, this is one of those moments in which we don't strive necessarily to be a topical show, Topher. Would you agree?
I mean, it's kind of to the point where it's like, of course, it has to somewhat be topical,
right? Because
the whole point is that we're discovering things that are enduring and interesting, and brands are always a conversation between reality and aspiration and, what's going on in the world today. But we don't necessarily lift these things. We don't lift our brands that we're going to tackle from the headlines.
Well, this is one of those instances in which the headlines are very relevant to a very recent episode of ours. So we did Chiquita in our last episode and talked a little bit about the kind of enduring legacy of the banana production industry in Central America. Talked a little bit about even a most recent judgment against Chiquita last year. Well, lo and behold, Chiquita is in the news as recently as last week for very similar activities. Top line, Chiquita has laid off their entire workforce in Panama rather than continue with a organized labor negotiation. And so if you want to kind of figure out what the backstory there is and how Chiquita got to that point, really suggest you take a listen to our episode, Low Hanging Fruit. We'll give you a lot of the backstory, how Chiquita arrived there, what legacy it's kind of perpetuating in South America and Central America, and maybe give you a little bit more of an understanding about what's happening currently.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating how easy, after having learned from what you shared with us about Chiquita's MO and how it moves into countries and operates, I thought it was really fascinating to be able to detect all of that DNA in this very, very recent article, the way that it interacts with labor, the way that it interacts with the local government, how it pits those two pieces against each other in order to create its own benefit. And then it kind of gets to be like, oh, we're really sorry that these two parties couldn't work anything out,
Yeah.
And so it just you kind of laid bare that DNA, that basic attack plan that they've been doing.
Yeah.
They just kind of ran it back. But the 2020s version.
Yeah, and that for me, it's just also there's something anachronistic about the scale of it, about saying you know what, we're just going to lay off everyone. That feels very...
Which, spoiler alert for those who haven't read the article, is kind of what happened,
yeah.
right? Is a little bit of background. Chiquita was kind of not loving the labor protests that were going on and basically probably worked through the Panamanian government to sort of draw a hard line that they knew that the labor protests wouldn't acquiesce to. And then we're well, it's untenable, so we're just going to get rid of everybody.
Yeah. And I just think there's something very 20th century about that. That's a tactic that is not, that's not a novel tactic. That comes from a history of colonialism and neocolonialism that is, something that's just not in the past. So anyways.
Well, what's interesting too is that stuff gets read, not to get too far deep into the woods, but we maybe had as America started learning how to do that on people we cared less about in countries we didn't care much about. But we do it domestically now all the time.
Yeah.
If you don't change your tax strategies, we're going to lay off everybody in your podunk town and we're going to take our factory somewhere else. And
exactly.
So those we're neo-colonizing our own regions now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, listen, I don't want to take us too far down a different path because we are going to be jogging into something hopefully a little bit more joyful, fun, light.
There's a lot of fun to be had
Okay,
in
great.
the New Balance episode. There's a lot of fun to be had. And how dark this gets is going to be entirely dependent on you, Robert.
Oh man, why don't you give me
So-
a job every time?
So maybe it will get dark. But what I'm going to say is that, like, I want to dive in. I want to give some, like, background on New Balance.
Yeah.
But all of this background is going to be in service of playing a game that I would like to call speculative branding.
Ooh.
And so I want to teach you a little bit of kind of like the core components of, give you like a TLDR on the history of New Balance. And then I'm going to posit to you different futures. And then what I want you to do is to take what we've learned about New Balance and what you imagine those futures to contain and say, like, here's a direction the brand could go. That how they would like lean on their core equities, but like move into a future here.
You do this. That you're like basically putting me on the spot to show whether or not I actually
Prove you can do your job.
Yeah, can I
Robert.
do my actual job?
I think it'll be fun. And
I just want to point out that my task to you was read something in the voice of Dr. Seuss. That was the task you got.
well,
I'm just
you farmed it out to Gemini, and I like to farm it out to you.
Okay.
I prefer to keep the work in human.
Oh, I
hands.
see. Yeah, you're right. Thank you.
So, I'll refresh you on the rules when we get to that.
Okay, perfect.
chunk. But let's dive into New Balance.
Okay, let's do it.
I'm going to talk about 3 basic phases of New Balance as a brand.
Yeah.
Kind of like it's 3 core iterations. Like you probably wouldn't break these out as like the 3 main pieces of like what it meant as like a corporation
Yeah.
or an operation. But these to me seem, after researching it, kind of like the 3 main iterations of how the brand interacted in America. And the 2 things that I think these really highlight are, 1, the state of exercise in America and how that related to culture. And then 2, how athletics helps navigate something that is a really important tension that creates what we would call like coolness, trendiness. And that tension is that tension between trying and not trying.
Uh-huh.
Cool, you can't not try at all. But you can't try too hard. All A's ain't cool.
Yeah.
And so I think the way that athleticism kind of helps navigate that comes to the fore as we dig into these
Okay.
things.
All right. I'm interested.
Okay, cool. Phase number 1. I'm going to call this phase New Balance and Athletics.
Okay.
This is from vaguely 1906 to 1970.
Wow.
So this is a phase in which we see New Balance being founded. 1906 is
You are
when it is founded
kidding
in
me.
Boston. Yep. It was founded by an Irish immigrant whose name was William J. Riley. And he immigrated to Boston.
Uh-huh.
And he founded the New Balance Arch Support Company in the Boston
okay.
area. Now, what's fascinating is that he actually is the originator of arch support.
Uh-huh.
And one of the first things I looked into was just kind of like, I remember as a kid, my mom being like, arch support's a really important thing in your tennis shoes and blah, blah, blah. And it is actually. I was like, is this just hoo-ha? Like, have we... Some of the things back in the 80s that we thought were super important in athletics, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
didn't necessarily pan out and be really important. But arch support was a revolutionary thing for him to have discovered. And William J. Riley actually came up with the idea, according to him, by looking at how the chickens in his yard walked. He said that the 3-toe with the back thing
Yeah.
provides the perfect kind of stability.
Yep.
So his arch support had a 3-point arch support, and he just made the arch supports themselves.
Uh-huh.
But that kind of like grew into a shoe company and kind of was a provider of athletic gear.
Can I just say that I don't look at a chicken and think that creature looks comfortable.
I want to run like that,
Yeah. It does
Like
not
a-
seem
like a real,
Yeah.
you
It's a
know,
little herky-jerky.
yeah.
It just seems like impossible that they should be balancing on these little sticks.
Yeah.
Oh, well, the guy's
But
a
maybe
visionary.
that's the thing. They discovered
Yeah,
a
that's
little
true,
secret.
yeah.
It spoke to William J. Riley, and it ended up being kind of a little bit of a revolutionary thing in athletics. And so New Balance was a sought after supplier of athletic gear. This is, when we're in 1906,
Right.
interestingly enough, we are basically just 10 years after the creation of the first American marathon.
Uh-huh.
In where?
Boston?
Boston.
All right, cool, perfect. You're a
Yeah.
marathoner, so you'd know that already.
Well,
I don't know if all
gosh, I
marathoners
didn't
know
want
that.
this to come up on the podcast.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I've run a mile or two. But so the Boston Marathon was founded in 1897, which was 1 year after the very first modern marathon was ever sort of founded and run.
And people at that
in
time
the
were like
Olympic
running
Games.
in gabardine pants, basically. It was just, there's
Yeah,
bowler
yeah,
hats and hobnail shoes and gabardine
Well, and
pants.
so because I'm a runner and also a little bit of a competitive dick, I was like, okay, so first marathon ever. I can dust these guys, right? Like, like there's
Totally.
no way that like these dudes running with canes are gonna like outpace me in my modern equipment and stuff like that. But Spiros somebody, who was the winner of the very first modern marathon at the very first modern Olympics in 1896 in Athens, he did it in under 3 hours. And I definitely have not run that fast.
And he had,
don't really aspire to.
he had tuberculosis and was probably a smoker.
Well, that's probably what made him so good. He survived to that. So he had
exactly.
lung capacity. Yeah. So in 1906, athletics, like you're seeing the formation of some of these things, but in the early 20th century, exercise was not the purview as we would think of it now of the average American.
Right.
Because the average American had an extremely physically demanding day, usually. They were either working in a factory or they were working on a farm. And so they didn't really need to worry about like how to move their body. What they wanted to do was like go home and sack out. You know what I mean? Like they were done. So athletics was very much the purview of those who had leisure time. And that is a little bit of foreshadowing to places we're going to go with New Balance later, with the pairing of athletics and leisure.
Yeah.
But, so what that means is that like New Balance isn't a cultural touchstone at all, because athletic gear is for your, moneyed American huntsman.
Yeah.
It's for your Ivy League collegiate, from, almost exclusively male, almost, exclusively white, exclusively privileged. So therefore, New Balance is just kind of the brand that people who do end up running find out about because it is a specialty supplier. That begins to transform a little bit because, and we'll dig into where culture kind of catches up to that eventually. But for ostensibly that like most of the 20th century, New Balance is kind of a very functional athletic supplier. They give you the equipment. So that's going to take us into our second phase of New Balance as a brand. And that is New Balance as fitness. So we're moving from New Balance as athletics to New Balance as fitness.
Okay.
What do you think is kind of happening by the time we get to the 1970s that takes us into this fitness space?
Jogging as a sport has
Fabulous.
come to be. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I did
when we
see
get into the
Forrest Gump, so I'm pretty schooled on this.
Yes. And, jogging was a symptom of probably a larger thing that was happening in the 1900s. People were working on farms. In the 1970s, huge portions of America are working in offices. They are commuting to work. They aren't moving. And so what you see in the 1970s is what they call the running boom. And that is very much brought about by jogging, which was a hilarious thing that actually, like, there's a lot of really funny articles where, like, early runners would be like, arrested and questioned by the police because they're like, why would you be running?
Yeah.
What are you running from?
Right.
So, there was a lot of like police would harass and question runners, but by the 1970s, Bill Bowerman, who later becomes sort of like the father of American running, deeply connected to Nike, deeply connected to Eugene, Oregon, not far from me here. He had been in New Zealand and saw all these people jogging. It was very popular in New Zealand. He was very impressed with the fitness of your average New Zealander.
Yeah.
And so he wrote a book about jogging, and he started to kind of like become a popular voice for, this as a sport. The reason why, like, we don't want to, like, it's not like Americans were like, gosh, I really want to be like the Kiwis. It met a need, which is that, like, anybody, anywhere can just, like, get out, do a little something good for their body. And so what you get with the running boom is that, it interacts with a lot of other pockets where things like athleticism have been brewing for a while, Boston being one of them. So Boston already has become sort of like the ancestral home of distance running in the U.S. because they have the longest running marathon there. It also is a city where you have a lot of people with money. So even during those earlier times, there were a lot of like athletic associations that started to form and like create the financial and societal cultural supports for sports. So you had people doing that earlier on. You also have an unusually high concentration of colleges and universities. So you have a lot of people who are doing athletics, staying in that area, wanting to stay involved, going into those athletic associations. So by the time the running boom comes out from the West Coast, you've got Boston really ready, not just with the people, but also with the equipment. So there's New Balance sitting there being like, oh, everybody wants to run now? Amazing. I've got just the stuff for you.
Okay, so before that, what kinds of things were they making? Like
they're making shoes
for like soccer cleats or things like that, or was it just because the running shoe? Like, what other shoe was there before the running shoe? Was it just like a basic trainer kind of thing?
I mean, I think you had special. I didn't do a lot of research into it. And then, you had to. Are you saying like is the running shoe a new thing?
Yeah, did it just come out of nowhere and they're like, oh, we need to design this new product like this because you're talking about
people had shoes that they ran in,
right?
Like that. New Balance originally just made some parts to be inserted into shoes, and then eventually. It would, New Balance was making just like the whole shoe itself.
Yeah.
The modern tennis shoe is not necessarily like the sneaker, you would say, is not a New Balance invention. A lot of people like to lay the credit for that on the Nike side on the West Coast. But I think in some ways it's kind of like those types of designs became pervasive, but like the purpose of the thing and the thing that New Balance represented was like, oh, do you want to run now, Mr. Office Dude in the 1972? Cool. We already make those shoes.
Right.
And so they start to make them for a broader set of America. And so you start to see designs co-opt that like sort of sneaker look and those types of things. But it is still really focused on a fitness setting.
Right.
It is like New Balance is the thing that has the arch support that's proven to be really good, that you're supposed to wear because it means that you can perform and be healthy. You can keep a balanced chicken-like stride as you're doing your athletics.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like, when the running boom transforms into the aerobics boom of the 80s, so like you start to see these successive kind of like exercise trends ripple through culture. And so this like fitness era is basically like 1970 to 2010-ish. That's kind of like our second era. So we've done athletics, which lasted from '06 to '70. We've done fitness from '70 to 2010. And then we're going to move into our third era with New Balance, which is New Balance as athleisure.
Ooh.
And that's 2010 to the present.
Okay.
And so some people like to say activewear now. A lot of people like to say activewear now because in some ways, like athleisure as a term has been maligned.
Yeah.
And, you know, some would say rightly so.
Uh-huh.
But I'd like to use it to refer to this, like the era that New Balance is in. Athleisure is actually a fascinating term. If you go back, you can see that it actually is referenced as early as 1979. Because as early as then, people started breaking the rules.
Right.
Right? Like, it was like, that's a running shoe, but you're wearing it in this way. Or, more typically, in the late 70s, starting to get into through like the early 90s, you saw this slow creep of the stuff that we were making for athletic wear influencing what fashion kind of looked like.
Yeah.
And so you had
the
and even less literal too. Like you would have like, I forget, there was like an article from like Women's Wear Daily in like 1994, and it used the term athleisure, and it defined athleisure as the inspiration of silhouette from athletics into a space where you would use like a canvas shoe or a suede shoe. So like a suede shoe that is borrowing from an athletic type shoe, they would call that athleisure.
Right.
Which is different from what we actually call athleisure now. And that's where I would say, like, that's why to me this athleisure phase doesn't really start until the 2010s, because really that is not about inspiration moving from one direction to the other. It's really about like actually you're using this thing. You're taking literally an athletic product and then you're just bringing it into a different space.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know if you are familiar with a podcast called Articles of Interest, Avery Trufelman.
I'm not. Tell me more.
Fascinating podcast. Phenomenal. It's a Radiotopia podcast. She herself did a lot of reporting for 99% Invisible, which is an iconic show. Articles of Interest is her pursuing her own passion, which is fashion. And she did a little capsule season where she studied Ivy style.
Oh, yeah.
Her thesis is kind of like the quintessential American style. And so I reference this when we're talking about this kind of athleisure phase, because it actually, when you start to dig into the history of athleisure and where it all comes from, fashion borrowing from athletics doesn't start just in this you know, late 1900s, early 2000s phase. It's actually something that has happened multiple times. I hear you nodding along and saying, are there any pieces that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I think like, you know, tennis fashion in the 80s and 90s for sure. Golf, certainly in the 80s, like the golf shirt becoming something that was just sort of ubiquitous. And then when you think about like how music has served as a arbiter between types of fashion, so like how hip hop has elevated things from certain athletics into larger fashion culture, that's like it becomes super really it's not just a most recent phenomenon for sure.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting that you bring up tennis, because you can go back to the 1920s and look at how fashion magazines were talking about trends back then.
Yeah.
What you had socially and what you had kind of like economically was women entering into society in totally new ways. They were dancing in nightclubs, they were riding on bicycles, they were actually playing sports, and there were a lot of iconic female athletes at the time that ended up becoming kind of the fashion plates or the exemplars for a new type of fashion that was more free-flowing, gave you the ability to move. And so tennis in the 1920s served as a major source of inspiration in terms of separates, in terms of how much you could move. And so you had magazines back in the 1920s saying like 75% of all of fashion that is happening in women's world today is coming from sport.
Huh. Yeah. I mean, it is interesting, and we sort of touched on a similar type of cycle in our Nordic track episode because it was also connected to fitness. We showed how fitness was connected to larger social movements that were happening in the 70s around women's rights and around bodily autonomy. And I'm curious where you're leading us to about this current moment.
Well, what we've talked about the precursors to athleisure, but I think it's kind of important to take that component heads on. And I think that you can parse this in a lot of ways, and we're living through this movement still, this moment still. So, we can't say like, boom, it's done. Here's basically what it was. But in my head, I think that there's sort of, especially if you look at how New Balance interacts in a world where athletics starts showing up in leisure. I think there's like two phases.
Okay.
The first phase is like your dad phase.
That's my first exposure to New Balance for sure.
What's interesting is that so you sent that hilarious SNL sketch with Zach Galifianakis where they're talking about kind of New Balance. That was, I think, 11 years ago, something like that. At that point, it had reached ubiquity enough that we could all laugh at the fact that there are people wearing athletic shoes, khakis, and a plaid shirt tucked into the khaki, and probably a backpack holding a really chunky laptop.
Yeah.
And that was kind of that was a person. And it was a little funny that this person, who very often might not necessarily look like your standard idea of a performance athlete, was wearing performance footwear.
Right, yeah.
And that had been happening for a while, well before COVID, so when people talk about what COVID did to athleisure, certainly when you get to things like sweatpants, it totally changed the game for that. But footwear was way ahead of COVID, what I mean?
Yeah.
Because we weren't wearing shoes anyway. We were just sitting around at home in our bare feet. But footwear was it was the tip of the spear in taking something that was made for an athlete into the IT department. So that's kind of the dad world.
Yeah.
I think there's some really interesting, people credit some really interesting celebrities specifically in bringing New Balance forward. And one of those celebrities is Jerry Seinfeld.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you look at a lot of not just episodes, if you think back in your head, you're like, oh, I guess he was wearing
on
New
Seinfeld,
Balance.
He was wearing New Balance?
Yeah, quite a bit.
Interesting.
But there's a lot of when he's doing promo photography for the show. Even before that, when he was doing stand-up and just becoming popular in the world of stand-up, there's a lot of Jerry Seinfeld rocking New Balance. And this is not, I couldn't find anything where he's talking about it specifically.
Yeah.
But one of the things that made me think that I think there's a cultural thread here that brings us to Jerry Seinfeld wearing New Balance with a leather jacket and a button-up shirt and some tight-fitting jeans is New Balance very early on in its days when it was still in its fitness or even its athletics era formed a very tight connection with the YMCA and the YWCA.
Okay.
And the YMCA and the YWCA became really important cultural touchstones, especially for Upper West Side culture in New York. And so if you think about, I can't say specifically if Jerry did go to a YMCA or not, but he grew up in an area, culture in New York where, connection with those types of institutions was well known. So I imagine Jerry Seinfeld being exposed to New Balance as a kid in the world of playing basketball.
Okay.
I imagine him being friends with people who really enjoyed New Balance. And I would imagine him then continuing to wear these shoes because for Jerry Seinfeld, all of his peers graduate,
Yeah.
they get office jobs, they have to wear loafers and brogues and all that stuff.
Right.
And he is a comedian, and he doesn't have to fucking do that.
Yeah.
And
he can wear New
I
Balance.
think, I think Jerry Seinfeld wearing New Balance feels a little bit like a thing that's like, I have a button-up shirt on,
Right.
but like I've got tennis shoes on. I'm a funny guy.
Yeah.
Like there's a little bit of like, I don't have to obey your rules. I'm not so buttoned up.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's crazy because out of that cast, I would have said that George was much more of a New Balance guy. The New Balance of the '90s feels very George Costanza.
Yeah.
But I mean, like Jerry kind of lending New Balance a bit of what sort of countercultural cachet he had is really interesting.
Well, because I would actually say, I get what you mean in terms of like a George type character.
Yeah.
We currently would imagine wearing New Balance.
Yeah.
But if you think about where he was in the show, he was working in an office. George was wearing
Right.
office shoes the whole time. Jerry could get away with wearing tennis shoes
Right.
because he didn't have to go to the
Had
office.
nothing to do
The
all day.
Georges of today are wearing New Balance
Yeah.
because the Jerrys of yesterday wore them first.
The Georges can run because Jerry walked, basically, is what
Yeah.
you're saying.
Yes,
love
and they
that.
both had phenomenal chicken-like arch support.
Topher, I want to explore something that's been in my head a little bit, and this is
Yes.
maybe from personal subjective experience. My exposure to New Balance was through my father early on, and he was a marathon runner, much like yourself. Probably not as prolific as you, but he was indeed a marathon runner when I was younger, and he ran in New Balance. And so my supposition was always that New Balance was kind of like special. Does that hold true? Was New Balance a little bit of a niche shoe? And then kind of as a follow-up question to that, I'm really interested in how those types of kind of niche performance shoes actually make the jump into culture. Like you think about Hoka right now, for instance. Like it's really interesting how these high performance shoes are becoming everyday shoes in ways that I don't think 10 years ago or 15 years ago would have been the case.
Yeah. I mean, I would personally say that the pivot point that happens that takes us from this shit is not for me, it's for my 40-year-old dad, to this shit is for me, is normcore,
Right.
dadcore.
Right.
This like moment where the deep respect for and love of irony in the millennial soul sort of began to eat its own disdain for old by looking old,
Yeah.
but in a funny way, in an intentionally cooler way, in a self-referential way.
Yeah.
It's not until normcore, dadcore, that you actually get kind of like a wholehearted adoption of clunkier, more specialty footwear, like looser, more beige and khaki, palettes. Like you have all those components that kind of get co-opted into millennial style and into like more popular culture from there. And that really serves as like a huge inflection point in taking athleisure from like a dad space, which is like, I deserve to be comfortable just like athletes do. And so I'm going to wear this shoe when I'm walking around the halls of my office, rather than something that like hurts me. I'm no longer going to put my tennis shoes in my bag or under my desk after I commute. I'm just going to keep them on because they look a little nicer.
Yeah.
Evolving into fashion through a millennial Instagram driven aesthetic that is kind of making fun of that, but in some ways has the same values. Like, I want to be comfortable too.
Yeah.
And so that begins high fashion, and very quickly millennial Instagram trend gets mashed up into collab aesthetic. And that's where you see sort of what would be like, I bought New Balance because they're the clunkiest, but like still like, they're not Asics, right? Like millennials didn't grab Sauconys.
Right.
They grabbed New Balance in some ways because it was like a blank palette. It was, you could pair it with other fashion. And like a Saucony was always going to just be like a mess.
Yeah.
You couldn't wear jeans with that. You couldn't wear khakis with that. But like a New Balance was clean enough, and other shoes had those. And certainly like you saw that kind of with like the Pumas coming back.
Yeah,
And
totally.
so, so like there was a lot of like pulling back of retro styles, but all of that kind of culminated in businesses like New Balance recognizing that at this point, the Supreme style collab model was a way for them to launch themselves into high fashion. And so in the 2010s to now, you see the athleisure space in general go from I want to be comfortable in an office to I want to be super high end.
Yeah.
I want to borrow the performance aesthetic to show off my physique or to look really clean and super crisp and, like really minimalist. There are a lot of different things that you can pull from that kind of like bring this in and take us to like where we are now with athleisure or active wear more broadly, which is what they call it now, which is, you've had your Yeezy moments, but you also have New Balance now being run with their creative director being the person who founded Aimé Leon Dore.
Oh, wow.
They're doing partnerships with Miu Miu. They're partnering with the Boston Red Sox.
What a
they're
journey.
kind of like fully into culture now and being little, like drivers of that aesthetic. So they've really kind of like arrived at that component there where like we're at the like New Balance as fashion. So, this takes us, we've now moved from these three basic phases of New Balance. The athletics phase, the fitness phase, the athleisure phase.
Yeah.
I want to give you a few highlights or like touchstones because we're going to start, we're going to start putting you through your paces.
Okay. Before we do that, I want to ask you.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that because of the story you've just laid out, these three eras that are so radically different, it makes the longevity of the brand even more remarkable. That for 60 years, there was no mass use case, really. Like, they were probably playing at the fringes of active wear, like. But there was nothing driving like the need for New Balance in a broad mix of like athletic shoes, and the fact that they sort of like survived to become something over that time to me is like shocking. It's like actually shocking.
Yeah, and you got to think in this like there was probably proliferations of other companies,
right?
That like they can't have been that they were the originator of the arch support, so they could claim that.
Sure.
But like I'm sure there were other companies out there that were like, we do that too, So I think there's probably unsung heroes in terms of just like straight up business acumen.
Yeah.
One of the things that actually is really fascinating too is that New Balance has always, and they say will always be made in the US.
Oh, cool. That's awesome.
So there's like this component of kind of like owning the production. New Balance has been able to justify its higher price points for being American made by talking about athletic excellence.
Right.
And so that has always been like a chunk there of like who they are. But it has probably allowed them to stay like a little closer to their customer, for example.
That's really interesting. Have they become a MAGA darling because of that? Do you know, or?
I didn't find anything like that. And certainly now it's not like I think it's not like 100.
Right, they must
There's
source
like a
stuff
thing.
from.
Yeah. So it's not like they're like making this from materials grown in the US, like 100%, like that sort of thing. But they do still have that as part of their business model, and it does differentiate them from all other footwear companies.
Yeah. You know what else is that stands out to me when I think about this brand, especially in the context of the category, is that they don't have an overt history. Like you think about Adidas, you got your Stan Smiths, you've got Converse that references Chuck Taylor. Like you've got a lot of footwear brands that reference their history and their past, and they lean on those connections to this era you're talking about, this athletics era. They kind of like celebrate their roots in that era. And I don't know of any of that in New Balance. It seems eternally new. I don't hear them talking about the New Balance past and the kind of New Balance, Hall of Heroes that we supported through. They don't talk. I at least have not seen them talk about like celebrated runners that use New Balance in the 60s and 70s, and like it doesn't seem like it's rooted in
Not much of a lore.
Yeah, there's not a lot of lore there. It just feels
Yeah.
like it shows up and you're like, oh, that's a New Balance, and it kind of like is both never changing and ever changing. It's sort of like shows up and it kind of looks the same. You mentioned sort of the beige period, which was like, there was a long time where it was just neutrals and light grays.
And that's very relevant now.
Yeah,
still.
totally.
Okay,
let's
so
go.
we're tracking. No, we're not. We're already working down the list. So what I was saying is that like let's ground ourselves in like the core equities that we've been talking about on New Balance.
Let's do it.
Because these are going to be your paints as you paint us a new canvas for 3 potential speculative branding
I have to make
futures.
3 fucking campaigns? Are you kidding me?
No, just riff. Don't get come on.
What am I getting paid
Calm
for
down.
this, Topher? This is ridiculous.
Yeah, you literally are getting paid for this.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
We own our own company.
Yeah. This is like when I would go home. So my mom had a bookstore. She's since retired, but when I would go home and she would try to get free ad campaigns out of me.
Well, you would help, right?
Of course I would help, but it would be like, sitting down to dinner and be like, well, what do you think about this? I'm like, okay.
I take it to a campaign if you want. I don't really care where you go with this.
Okay.
My point is just like what's the role? Like okay, so what we're gonna do is like there's core equities in New Balance brand, and I'm sorry this so pains you.
Oh goodness.
Now I'm like, okay, if this is how your mom got work from you, let me lean into the Catholicism a little bit. I'm sorry this is so painful for you, but I appreciate you leaning in.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got, like, in terms of core equities that New Balance brings to the table that are, like, enduring, right? That we're going to say, like, these are things that, like, and no matter from our, like, 3 phases all the way through to now, what are the things that are consistent that would, like, we would need to lean on and find space for somewhere in the future? Like, just this straight up, like, arch support, athletic excellence, like, that grounding in sort of, like, the functional, finding the right way to help support you with equipment.
Gotcha.
I think at this point you can sort of bank on that like cool factor that athleticism brings into culture. So the connection of athletics into non-athletic spaces and how that brings a little bit of pizzazz, a little bit of cool factor there. Made in America, I think we should keep that.
Okay.
They have themselves a brand promise that they have on the bottom of their website that says fearlessly independent. I'm not quite sure what that means for us, but I put it forward to you. Like, they are made in America. They aren't part of some massive big holding company, so like, I think
who looks
they
at
bring that
Nike
into a fashion
and says,
space.
Boy, they seem really dependent. I don't know. That seems strange. Okay. Yep. Okay.
And then the name, New Balance. An enduring name.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 futures, and I just want you to riff on like, okay, in this type of future, I imagine I will define what's happening.
Okay.
And then every assumption you make is yours to make. You don't have to ask like, is it this? Is it? It's whatever you assume.
Okay. What's the future?
All right, first one. It's 5 years from now.
Okay.
And our economy is experiencing a recession.
You're giving it 5 years. Okay, yeah. And you want
So
me?
what would you say? What are the types of things you think? Like, how would New Balance need to come to life in a world where money is tight?
Well, I mean, I think like in terms of activities, running is a pretty cheap activity. You don't need much gear besides what's on your feet. You don't need any facilities besides a road or a sidewalk in front of you. And so, if you want to tap into, I mean, I think it's probably somewhat exhausted already, but like, tap into the community of running for people who want ways to keep themselves fit and healthy that isn't gym membership dependent. Discretionary spending goes out the window immediately, or is the first thing to go during a recession. So kind of leaning into the the freedom that running can give you, the independence that it can give you, the freedom that is both mental, but also you don't have to pay anybody to do it. You don't get tithed to take care of yourself if you have a pair of running shoes, a pair of New Balance in the open road.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think what I like about what you were talking about this future for them, leaning into kind of like the actual just relationship of running, is it would be maybe if we're moving into a recession, as you were talking about, I was thinking like, yeah, discretionary spending going down, maybe like high end, super Miu Miu collabs aren't going to be the way to, American consumers' hearts in a time when like we're really having a tough time economically. So being something that's a little bit more accessible could actually work positively for New Balance. It leans into that fearlessly independent. Like they could own that more.
Yeah,
if
totally.
that's really a space that they want to be. You were talking about what running, how it makes you feel, like that, like fearless independence in a time when like everything else seems harder, like going out and hitting the road. And I was also thinking, as you were talking about that, like the Made in America component might potentially help if you're like building the economy back here, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the things I was thinking about was what weight can a product or a brand like this carry, right? Like, could a shoe carry the weight of we're made in America, so we're helping bring the economy back? And I think we've seen brands kind of play that sometimes, and you're like, that seems like an overplay sometimes for a candy bar or like a So you're like, what can the brand carry in terms of like those moments, and how much of a message can it hold to respond to a moment like a recession or a moment of national focus or tragedy, like, and that's where you have to kind of tread carefully, if you'll forgive the pun. Like it's what do you look to a brand like a shoe brand to solve for you as a consumer,
Yeah, kind of like it's sort of like getting down to brass tacks. Like, this isn't as much a time for, the more like high level aspirational stuff.
Yeah.
And you can still have aspiration, but in a time where, people, when you're speaking to people for whom those aspirations might feel a little bit irrelevant, or like you're ignoring their current state.
Yeah.
How do you speak to their state, but still speak to where they're at, but still bring in something that they care about?
Right.
And so you're leaning into this, like, runner hitting the road as a way to kind of free yourself and empower yourself.
Right.
I think that's a really interesting space.
Cool.
Okay. So that's speculative future for a New Balance One.
Okay.
Now, number 2, we 20 years from now, geopolitically are in a space where a significant portion of the population is up for and being readily pulled into military conscription.
Okay.
So there's a lot of military activity. People are getting pulled into the military. There's a lot of traveling around the world to go fight on things. We're kind of facing a world, more militarized and more mobilized society.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think at that point they have to introduce a new product and a new partnership. So maybe going back to their roots and doing arch support for combat boots, doing, and I imagine that, like, given the trajectory we're on right now, that the idea of public and private is going to be completely mixed anyway. So it's probably going to be the U.S. Army sponsored by New Balance, or everything is for sale. So there might be a readily available collab with there immediately.
That's fascinating. Yeah. That's, oh my gosh, imagining like military uniforms that are sponsored the way that soccer uniforms
100%.
are, or NASCAR uniforms. You see, it's like the tanks look like NASCAR cars. Wow.
Yeah. So, there's that possibility.
Yeah.
I think that there's also going to potentially be a premium put on time when you're not serving. And that time that is truly yours, if you're conscripted and then yours time that is actually yours, what do you do with that time? And it goes back to kind of what you were saying about the notion of the connection between athletics and leisure time. Does New Balance provide something in that?
Like more relaxing, more downtime,
Yeah.
like almost slippers or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. What else? What else would be an opportunity?
I was interested in the material aspect as you started talking about this stuff. Like I was thinking, going back to times when the U.S. has been involved in conflicts before, it like puts a premium on certain types of materials where it's like, we're going to take all the rubber.
Right.
No one gets to use rubber. And so everything else has to kind of get creative with the types of stuff that they make.
I just had a weird thought along the lines of kind of like a future in which the public has been subsidized by the private in a overt fashion, is a future in which brand beliefs and brand promises actually hold geopolitical sway. So, for instance, you're mentioning a time in which you imagine a future in which there's a lot of conflict, and it's such that nations need to mobilize their populace in armed services to wage war against one another. Mm-hmm. What if a brand that stood for the notion of balance became a geopolitical actor? And in the way that the Vatican has tried to be a geopolitical actor. What if a brand tries to broker peace because it believes in this notion of balance? What if like brand beliefs become the new constitutions, the new Magna Carta of the world, and brands as organizations fight for or stand up in the public sphere for what they claim to believe as organizations?
Right. And they like, we as a world, as a species, must stand as steadily as a chicken.
The fact that this is always...
It just helps me realize, like, that's the thing, apparently the dude kept a chicken foot on his desk.
I mean, that's pretty, that's legit. I feel
Kind
like
of metal.
Yeah,
I
that's
like
a little
that.
bit, that is a bit metal. And I also think that that's a person who kind of like put his beliefs really out there. And I appreciate that. Okay. So that's two.
That's two.
Okay.
Number 3, 50 years in the future, the United States, as many other countries at that point have, institutes a universal basic income. AI is doing all the work.
Yeah.
And we're all we can continue to go out there and do more if we want to, but we can also kind of just sit around and do whatever we like.
Okay, I got it. I've been waiting for this one. Do you ever see the movie WALL-E?
You know what? I am aware of it, and I have not watched the whole thing. I think I watched pieces of it on planes multiple times.
So there's, it's basically a movie in two parts. There's WALL-E by himself on the planet, and then there's WALL-E up in space on where the last vestiges of humanity are. And humans have been in space so long that their bones have kind of separated, and they're all hugely overweight, and they get tooted around in these little hovering chairs. Yeah. So I think that's where we're at. And what New Balance is going to take the chicken foot and invert it into a supportive. Oh. So instead of arch support, it'd be ass support, and scoot people around with their cartilaginous bones and and their masses, and support them in a whole different way, not as a shoe, but as an enveloping chair.
Okay, you take the same supportive technology, and then in a world where you don't really have gravity, it's used in a very different way.
Yeah, you lean into support. You go back to your roots, which is our roots are in, avoiding knee blowouts by giving you better arch support, and turn that into, for the modern age where nobody's actually working, there's no labor, we spend most of our time plugged into a network. How can we support the human physiology?
Yeah.
There you go.
That's I was even thinking then, because what does athletic excellence look like in a world where effort is no longer needed? Part of me was I could see a world where rather than in a life of infinite leisure, we end up opting into a life of infinite athletic toil.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is that there's also, this is a future maybe 5 years ago, if you had asked me this question, or 3 years ago in the middle of the NFT crypto phase, there's a world in which I would have said that New Balance would shift to a totally digital brand, totally digital product, and it would be selling things to support our digital personas rather than our physical personas, and that could still be a thing,
Yeah.
But there was already some really interesting stuff happening around the translation of physical products into a digital token, and vice versa, and what that meant. And I think that was a really interesting place to start to explore. So maybe that's another option, that New Balance becomes a purely ephemeral brand that doesn't actually exist in the real world anymore. And
Yeah. All right. So we've got like return to running.
yeah,
We've got sponsoring tanks, and we've got space thrones.
Space Thrones, yeah.
And these are the three basic futures that we should proactively pitch to the
I love it.
executives at New Balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could make a case for all of them, and we could link them to their brand very, very easily.
Yes. Done. All right. So we've got our work ahead of us on that one.
I mean, frankly,
But,
50 years from now, I'm not planning on being here, so
You don't want a space throne?
I don't want a Space Throne.
Well, 50 years from now, you might not be around, but a month from now,
Yes.
you will be around,
Oh,
and you will
look at that! What an
telling us.
amazing transition!
digging that.
What a turn!
You will be telling us about the next brand that you're going to be researching.
Okay.
Would you like to learn about it?
I would like to learn. I'm nervous. I don't know. This is like the first time I've been nervous, Topher. I don't know why.
Yeah. You seem a little. You have nothing to be nervous about.
Yeah, I feel like we raised the bar continuously.
Oh, you're just like, how will I possibly?
Yeah, but I'm also feeling like I
feel like you continue to, level things up. I thought I was skating by with a little bit of like imagination work. I was just kind of like, I didn't have to do any, I didn't make any poems. I was just like,
imagination
hey,
work is
what
where
about,
it's at.
what about a future where universal basic income? Let's go yang gang on this.
Okay, all right. So you're telling me what I will be looking into. Is there any? What's the preamble here? Get
No
romance
preamble. Oh, let's see. I want to get, we've talked about athletics, performance, really like aspirational moments, but I kind of want to get back to basics. I want to get back to the nitty gritty brass tacks of what it means for us to just like get some work done.
Uh-huh.
As like people who have desk jobs.
Okay.
I'm in this space of like churning stuff out,
Yeah.
getting things done,
Okay.
putting ideas on the wall
Okay.
with a Post-it note.
Ooh, I love this. I love this.
I want us to focus on the craft of advertising. Post-it notes are, like an absolute must-have in like your stereotypical like advertising office.
Right.
You see them everywhere.
I already know something about the origin of the Post-it note.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think
Awesome.
we have talked about that origin story in
We did
yes,
actually.
and I don't remember what that was on.
I know exactly what that was. That was in our interview with Adam
Right.
Christensen.
Correct.
And
yes.
we were talking about hacking things together.
Right.
And so that must have sat in the kernel of my subconscious.
Here, there, but not too strongly.
Yeah, exactly. Not enough to leave a mark.
Correctly.
But yeah, you referenced a little bit of its creation, but I don't think we got any deeper into it.
No, it was in the question. It was in our off-brand quiz, and it was about unintended consequences, basically. How things that were made for one purpose ended up being used for another purpose. And I don't want to ruin anything else
Right.
beyond that, but I think that's that's a good place to start. If you want a little bit of like a taste of where we're headed, maybe listen to that interview on Stranger Coordinates with Adam Christensen, the CMO of Notified.
Yes, please.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm going to dig into that. I'm going to turn this into just a wall of fragments everywhere. Just going to be completely surrounded. Okay, awesome. Well, that's going to be great. For the story behind Post-it notes, I was going to make some really shitty pun, and I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to end on a shit pun. I'm not going to do it. Anyways, let's just see what happens. Join us next time. We'll be talking about Post-it. You've been listening to Strange Coordinates. It's the show where we use brands as roadmaps to arrive at fascinating places. Your hosts are Topher, who has been delivering a real blockbuster this time, and me, Robert Balog. If you want to learn more about our agency, which would be awesome if you did, go to our website. It's weareterritorial.com. You can join our mailing list there. I would say that we've really upped our mailing list game, and I know we kind of milk the mailing list at the end of this every single time, but most recently we've had webinars, we've had podcast episodes, we've had we've had so much stuff.
AI think pieces. Yep.
It's good stuff. So join the mailing list, and then also follow us on LinkedIn. I think that'd be great as well. We post a lot of stuff there. We look forward to seeing you there, and if not, here in a few weeks. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
I'm like, you and I maybe are hearing a different song because I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, you're like, what's going on over there?
You have the 5 o'clock shadow of a person who's been up all night trying to solve a murder.
Yeah.
You're just putting the story together for New Balance, you know?
Yeah.
Did you do like a wall with
the like yarn? Yeah, the yarn.